The sun was already dipping low over the endless plains of Arizona when Caleb McAllister guided his weary horse down a narrow dirt trail. Dust rose around the animal's hooves, catching the golden light and making the landscape shimmer in the heat of the evening. Caleb's worn hat shaded his eyes, but it could not hide the tension in his face. He had been riding for days, moving farther west than he had ever been before. The town on the horizon was small, just a few wooden buildings clinging to the edge of the desert, but it promised work and perhaps a place to rest. Caleb had learned long ago that the frontier could be cruel and that strangers were watched with suspicion. He had arrived in settlements before, always quietly, always observing first. There was a rhythm to these towns, children running barefoot, men leaning against the wooden posts of saloons, women carrying buckets of water or tending gardens. Everyone had a story, and Caleb had a habit of listening more than speaking. But this town felt different somehow. There was a hush, a carefulness, as though the wind carried whispers that only certain ears could hear. He led his horse toward the small stable at the edge of town. The building was simple, rough-hewn planks, a roof patched with tin, but it would do. Caleb dismounted, patting his horse's neck, and felt the familiar ache in his shoulders from hours in the saddle. As he worked to secure the animal, he noticed movement just beyond the stable. A woman appeared, walking slowly among the rocks and sagebrush. She was tall, with long dark hair tied back loosely, and her eyes held a quiet intensity that made Caleb pause. There was something in the way she moved, the careful way she observed him, that made the air feel charged. She stopped, just out of reach, and spoke in a low voice that carried clearly in the still evening. "Don't look away." Caleb's hand instinctively went to the brim of his hat, tipping it slightly. He had heard warnings before, but something about her tone was different. It was not fear or threat, but a demand for attention, a call to see the truth in what was around him. He nodded, though she could not see him clearly, and spoke cautiously. "I didn't mean to intrude, just passing through." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly and turned away. Caleb watched her disappear behind a rise in the land, feeling a strange curiosity he could not explain. Who was she? Why had she said those words? He had learned that the frontier was full of stories, some spoken, many hidden beneath the surface, and he sensed that her story was one of the latter. Inside the stable, Caleb settled his horse and began to remove the saddle and gear. As he worked, he allowed his mind to wander, thinking about why he had come so far west. The past few years had been harsh, filled with arguments, mistakes, and a life that seemed to slip away no matter how hard he tried to hold it. The open plains had always called to him, offering a chance to start over. But the solitude came with its own dangers. There were men who would take advantage of strangers, and the land itself could be unforgiving. He finished tending to his horse and walked toward the town's main street. The buildings were weathered, each telling a story of storms, sand, and time. A general store sat at the corner, its windows dusty but clear enough to see the goods inside. A blacksmith's hammer rang out rhythmically, and the sound carried across the street. Children ran by, chasing each other in games that left them laughing and out of breath. Men nodded curtly as he passed, and a few women glanced quickly before returning to their work. Caleb felt the eyes of the town on him, measuring him, trying to understand if he belonged. He entered the general store, brushing dust from his coat. The store smelled of leather, dried herbs, and the faint sweetness of preserved fruit. A man behind the counter looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You new around here?" the man asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Caleb nodded. "Just passing through. Looking for work. Maybe a place to stay." The man studied him for a moment. "You're not the first stranger to wander in, and you won't be the last. The town can be harsh if you don't know how to watch and listen. Keep your eyes open, And your hands ready." Caleb allowed a small smile. "I know how to do that." After purchasing a few supplies, flour, dried meat, and a small tin of coffee, he stepped back into the evening light. The sun had almost disappeared behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. As he walked back toward the stable, he couldn't shake the image of the woman he had seen earlier. Her presence lingered in his mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. The next morning, Caleb awoke before the sun, the cool desert air filling his lungs. He saddled his horse again, ready to explore the surrounding land and see if there was work to be found. As he moved through the sparse trees and rocky outcrops, he saw her again, Nayeli. She was gathering firewood, her movements careful and precise. This time she noticed him immediately and held his gaze, unblinking. Caleb dismounted and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Good morning," he said softly. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched him, her eyes sharp, like a hawk studying its prey. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "The world is not just what you see. There are truths hidden in plain sight. You must learn not to look away." Caleb felt a chill, though the sun was rising and warming the land. There was something in her words, a weight of experience, loss and survival, that made him pause. He wanted to ask her more, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded. "I'll try." Over the next few days, Caleb began to notice the small details of life in the desert that he had always overlooked. He watched how Nayeli moved, how she interacted with the land, and how the animals responded to her presence. She was careful, deliberate, and respectful. Each action she took seemed to have a purpose, a reason beyond what he could immediately understand. Caleb began to realize that her warning, "Don't look away," was not just about danger or observation. It was about paying attention to life itself, to the moments that could teach lessons if one only had the patience and courage to notice them. He had spent so much of his life running from his past that he had forgotten how to truly see. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Caleb and Nayeli sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the plains. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scents of earth and distant rain. Nayeli broke the silence. "You have strength," she said quietly. "But strength alone is not enough. You must learn to endure, to witness, to hold pain, and still move forward. That is the way of the Apache widow." Caleb listened, trying to understand. Her words were not easy, and they carried a truth he had not expected. He realized that the life he had known, the fast decisions, the easy fights, the fleeting victories, was not enough to prepare him for the lessons she would teach. He would have to be patient, humble, and willing to face both the world and himself without turning away. That night, as Caleb lay under the stars with the cool desert air surrounding him, he thought about the journey ahead. The frontier was not just a place of land and danger, but a place of learning, of confronting truths, and of discovering strength in unexpected ways. Nayeli had given him his first lesson without even trying to teach him. Look closely, listen carefully, and do not look away from what matters most. The days that followed were filled with quiet observation. Caleb began to notice patterns in the land, the way animals moved, the signs of weather, the subtle changes in light and shadow. He began to understand the rhythms that governed life here, guided by Nayeli's silent wisdom. And though she spoke little, each word she chose seemed to carry the weight of a life fully lived, of pain endured, and of a strength that came from knowing loss and continuing on. For Caleb McAllister, the frontier was no longer just a place to escape from the past. It was a place to learn, to grow, and perhaps to discover a new way of living, one where courage was measured not by the gun one carried, but by the willingness to face life with eyes wide open. And for the first time in many years, he felt that he was ready to begin. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Caleb McAllister awoke to the faint sound of wind rustling through the sagebrush. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind. Nayeli's words, her presence, the quiet intensity in her eyes. He had spent the night thinking about what she had said, the warning, "Don't look away." Now, with the morning light spreading across the plains, he felt a mixture of curiosity and unease. After a simple breakfast of coffee and dried meat, Caleb mounted his horse and rode toward the area where he had first seen Nayeli gathering firewood. He had no clear plan, only the sense that she could teach him something he had never learned before. As he approached, he noticed her moving with careful precision, selecting sticks and twigs, stacking them neatly. She paused, sensing his presence, and looked up. "You came back," she said, her voice calm but steady. "I thought you might." Caleb dismounted, keeping his distance, unsure of how to speak without breaking the rhythm she had set. I want to learn," he said finally, "if you are willing to teach me." Nayeli studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Learning is not easy. It takes patience. It takes seeing what others overlook, and it begins with respect for the land, for life, and for yourself." Caleb felt a weight in her words. He had always thought of learning as something that could be achieved quickly, with effort and strength, but Nayeli's approach was different. It was quiet, deliberate, and demanded attention to things most people ignored. The first lessons were simple, yet profound. Nayeli showed Caleb how to track animals in the desert, not just by following footprints, but by noticing broken twigs, disturbed sand, and even subtle changes in the wind. She taught him to observe the land carefully, where the water might be hidden, which plants were safe to eat, and which signs indicated danger. Caleb realized that these skills were not just survival techniques, they were lessons in patience, awareness, and humility. "You must always watch," Nayeli explained one afternoon as they crouched behind a cluster of rocks, observing a herd of deer in the distance. "Do not rush. Do not act until you understand. Most people move too quickly, seeing only what they want to see. The world gives away its truths only to those who wait." Caleb listened, trying to quiet the restlessness that had always been a part of him. He had spent so much of his life reacting without thinking, fighting before understanding, and now he was being asked to stop, to watch, and to learn. It was harder than he expected. Over the following days, Nayeli introduced Caleb to other aspects of the Apache widow way. She taught him how to gather medicinal herbs, explaining which plants could soothe pain, heal wounds, or calm the mind. Each plant had a story, she told him, a purpose beyond its immediate use. Caleb began to understand that knowledge was not just about survival, it was about connection, respect, and understanding the world in a deeper way. One afternoon, as the sun hung high and harsh in the sky, Nayeli brought Caleb to a quiet canyon. The walls were steep, the rocks jagged, and the air smelled faintly of earth and stone. Here she taught him about silence and observation. "Sit," she instructed, pointing to a flat rock. "Do nothing for a while. Watch the light. Watch the shadows. Listen to the wind. The desert speaks, but only to those who are willing to hear." Caleb obeyed, feeling the heat of the stone beneath him and the slow rhythm of his own breathing. At first he grew restless. He wanted to ask questions, to move, to act, but Nayeli's eyes, steady and patient, reminded him of the lesson. Endurance was part of learning. Over the hours, he began to notice small details he had never seen before, the patterns of ants crossing the sand, the way a bird tilted its head when it sensed movement, the rustle of distant grass as a lizard scurried by. "This is how you begin to understand," Nayeli said softly, sitting beside him. "Not by forcing knowledge, but by paying attention, by listening, and by seeing what others miss." Caleb's respect for Nayeli grew each day. She was strong, yes, but her strength was quiet, thoughtful, and rooted in experience. She had lived through loss, seen violence, and yet carried herself with dignity and calm. Caleb could sense that the widow way was not just about surviving, but about thriving in a world that often demanded harshness and speed. It was a way of living fully, with awareness, resilience, and an unshakable sense of purpose. One evening, as they sat by a small fire near the canyon, Nayeli spoke of her past. Her voice was low, almost mournful but steady. She told Caleb about her husband and children, taken in a raid years ago, and how she had survived by learning to rely on herself and the land around her. She spoke of grief, of moments when despair threatened to overwhelm her, and of how she had learned to face that pain rather than hide from it. "You see," she said, staring into the flames, "the world will test you. It will take things from you. But if you do not look away, if you face it fully, you learn to endure. You learn to become stronger than you ever imagined." Caleb listened in silence. Her words struck him deeply. He had never faced such loss, not in the way she had, but he understood the meaning of endurance. He understood that courage was not measured by bullets or fists, but by the willingness to confront life's hardships without turning away. In the days that followed, Nayeli tested Caleb's skills. She set small challenges for him, tracking a rabbit without disturbing the terrain, identifying herbs blindfolded, noticing subtle changes in the weather. Each task seemed simple, yet it demanded focus, patience, and humility. Caleb often failed at first, but Nayeli's guidance was patient. She never scolded. She corrected, demonstrated, and allowed him to try again until he improved. Through these lessons, Caleb began to notice changes within himself. His movements became slower, more deliberate. His senses sharpened. He started seeing the details of the world around him, the bend of a tree branch, the footprints in the sand, the way light shifted across the rocks. Most importantly, he began to understand Nayeli's whispered warning. "Don't look away." Life was full of signals, of truths hidden in plain sight, and only by paying attention could one truly live. One afternoon, as a gentle breeze stirred the canyon, Caleb and Nayeli came across a dry riverbed. Nayeli knelt and traced her fingers over the sand, showing him the subtle marks left by creatures that had passed through. She explained how to read the patterns, to understand not just what had happened, but what might happen next. "You see," she said, "the land speaks to those who watch. It tells you about hunger, about danger, about the hidden life around you. To ignore it is to remain blind. To look away is to fail yourself." Caleb nodded, feeling a new respect for the land and for Nayeli. He realized that the cowboy way he had known, fast, rough, and often careless, was incomplete. True understanding required patience, observation, and the willingness to learn from someone who had seen and endured far more than he ever had. As the sun set behind the mesas, casting long shadows across the desert, Caleb and Nayeli sat quietly by the riverbed. The wind whispered, the sand shifted softly, and the world seemed alive in a way he had never noticed before. He felt a sense of calm and focus he had never experienced, a connection to the land and to the lessons Nayeli was teaching him. For the first time, Caleb understood that the Apache widow way was more than survival. It was a philosophy of life. It was about endurance, observation, respect, and courage. It was about facing reality fully, without turning away, and finding strength in knowledge and awareness. That night, as Caleb lay under the stars, he thought of the day's lessons. He realized that he was not just learning skills, he was learning a new way to see the world. Nayeli's teachings were slowly reshaping him, turning the restless, impulsive cowboy into someone capable of patience, focus, and understanding. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to continue. And so, Caleb McAllister, guided by the quiet wisdom of Nayeli, began to walk the path of the Apache widow way, one careful step at a time, learning to endure, to observe, and to never look away. The days that followed were filled with quiet lessons, patience, and observation. Caleb McAllister had grown more aware of the desert's subtle rhythms, the whispers of the wind, and the life hidden in its smallest details. Nayeli continued to guide him with her calm presence, teaching him not just how to survive, but how to truly see. Yet the desert held more than serenity. Its vast openness concealed dangers, and Caleb would soon discover that the past he thought he had escaped was never far behind. It began one morning when Caleb rode toward the canyon to check traps he had set under Nayeli's instruction. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. As he approached a familiar rock formation, he noticed signs that made his heart quicken. The ground was disturbed. Footprints pressed deep into the sand. Horses' hooves had crushed small bushes, and the scent of smoke lingered faintly in the air. He dismounted quickly, letting the horse graze as he examined the scene. "Not good," he muttered under his breath, recognizing the signs of outsiders. Men who moved fast, left little behind, and often brought trouble. Before he could consider his next step, a distant shout carried across the plains. Caleb's instincts, honed by years on the frontier, told him it was a warning or a call for conflict. He mounted his horse and rode back toward Nayeli's place, his mind racing. When he arrived, he saw her standing near the edge of the rocks, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "They are coming," she said simply, her voice steady but carrying an unspoken weight. "You see why I said not to look away? The land speaks. Danger often arrives quietly, but it is never silent if you pay attention." Caleb nodded, realizing that this was a test of everything he had learned. He had been preparing for survival, observation, and endurance, and now those lessons would be put to the ultimate test. Nayeli moved with a quiet precision, signaling him to follow. She led him to a hidden path behind a ridge, a place where the land's natural formations created a protective barrier. "Stay close and watch," she whispered. "We will need your courage, but also your patience. Rush, and you will fail." From their vantage point, Caleb could see a small group of men approaching the settlement. They rode recklessly, laughing loudly, their intentions clear to anyone who had lived on the frontier. These were outlaws, opportunists, looking to intimidate and take whatever they could from the town and surrounding lands. Caleb's hand rested on his revolver, but he remembered Nayeli's lessons. This was not a situation that could be solved by force alone. Observation, planning, and awareness would be key. As the outlaws drew closer, Nayeli pointed to subtle signs in the environment. A bent branch indicated the best hiding spot. A shadowed crevice suggested a natural trap point. Caleb followed her silently, his pulse quickening, absorbing every detail she shared. The skills he had learned over the past days, tracking, observation, patience, suddenly had a purpose beyond learning. They were about to be tested in reality. The outlaws reached the edge of the settlement, shouting at the townspeople and demanding supplies. Caleb and Nayeli watched as the villagers scrambled, fear evident on their faces. Caleb wanted to rush in, to confront the men with his gun, but he remembered Nayeli's lessons. Strength alone was not enough. Strategy, awareness, and restraint were equally important. Nayeli placed a hand on his arm. Remember, the widow way is not just about defense. It is about understanding, anticipating, and acting with clarity. Watch and learn, then act. Caleb nodded, focusing on the details he might have missed without her guidance. He noticed the way the wind carried sound, how the outlaws' horses moved, and how they communicated without words. Nayeli signaled him to move closer, pointing to a narrow canyon path the outlaws could not see. "This way," she instructed. "We will guide them into a trap, using what they do not expect." They crept along the path, careful to remain unseen. Caleb marveled at Nayeli's knowledge of the land. Every rock, every shadow, every bend in the canyon was familiar to her. Her movements were deliberate, her attention unwavering. He realized that her strength came not from brute force, but from understanding and anticipating the world around her. As they positioned themselves, Caleb noticed the outlaws dividing into smaller groups, some searching the edges of the town, others heading toward what they thought was a hidden supply store. Nayeli whispered instructions, and Caleb followed, adjusting his position based on the subtle cues she gave. They waited, quiet as the desert itself, until the men moved exactly where Nayeli had predicted. Then, in a carefully timed action, they executed their plan. Rocks were dislodged to startle the horses, forcing the outlaws to react, while Caleb and Nayeli used the natural barriers of the canyon to guide them away from the townspeople. The plan worked with precision, demonstrating how knowledge and observation could triumph over recklessness and brute force. Caleb felt a surge of pride, not for the act of fighting, but for understanding the strategy, anticipating the danger, and using his new skills effectively. After the outlaws were driven back, Nayeli led Caleb to a quiet spot overlooking the plains. The townspeople began to return to their routines, grateful but shaken. Caleb dismounted and sat on a rock, his hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline. Nayeli stood beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You did well," she said softly. "But this is only the beginning. Danger will come again, in ways you may not expect. Remember what I taught you: endurance, observation, patience, and courage. Strength without awareness is useless." Caleb nodded, understanding more deeply than ever the weight of her words. The outlaws were only one test, one small measure of the challenges that life in the frontier could bring. Nayeli's lessons were about more than surviving a single threat. They were about preparing for the unpredictability of life, about learning to face hardship without turning away. That night, as the sky darkened and the stars began to shine over the desert, Caleb sat near the campfire with Nayeli. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and distant earth. He thought about his past, the mistakes, the violence, the fear that had driven him west, and realized that he had often looked away from his own truths. Now, under Nayeli's guidance, he was learning to confront life fully, without avoidance or fear. Nayeli noticed his thoughtful expression. "Do not think that courage is the absence of fear," she said quietly. "It is the ability to act despite fear. To look at life fully even when it is difficult. That is the widow way." Caleb considered her words carefully. He had spent much of his life running from danger, from pain, from responsibility. Yet now he felt a shift inside him, a growing awareness that strength and courage were not about escaping life, but embracing it, even when it was hard. The following days brought more challenges. Caleb and Nayeli continued to observe the land, preparing for the possibility that the outlaws might return. They taught the townspeople small skills, how to recognize subtle signs in the terrain, how to move quietly, how to use the land to their advantage. Caleb noticed that he was not only learning from Nayeli, but also growing in confidence, able to teach and guide others, applying the lessons she had patiently shared. One afternoon, as they scouted a nearby ridge, Caleb spoke of the past he had tried to leave behind. He told Nayeli of a family he had lost to a violent encounter, of mistakes he had made in his youth, and of the guilt that had followed him across plains and deserts. Nayeli listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her presence calm. "You cannot change the past," she said when he finished. "But you can learn from it. You can let it shape you, guide you, and teach you to act wisely. That is the strength of endurance. That is the widow way." Caleb felt the truth of her words settle deep within him. He realized that the journey he had begun was not only about survival in the desert, but about surviving himself, his fears, his regrets, and his ignorance. Each lesson from Nayeli was a step toward understanding, toward becoming someone capable of facing life fully without looking away. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Caleb and Nayeli returned to their camp. The outlaws had not yet returned, but Caleb no longer felt the same fear he had felt at first. He knew now that awareness, strategy, and patience were as powerful as any weapon. He had begun to understand the balance of strength and wisdom, courage, and observation. That night, Caleb lay under the stars, thinking of the lessons he had learned. He understood that the frontier was not just a place of danger, but a place of growth, of learning, and of testing oneself. Nayeli had shown him that true courage came from facing life fully, from observing carefully, and from acting with wisdom. The outlaws had been the first real test of this knowledge, and he had passed, not by fighting recklessly, but by learning, watching, and acting with understanding. In the quiet of the desert night, Caleb made a silent promise to himself. He would continue to learn from Nayeli. He would continue to face life without looking away. And he would honor the lessons of the Apache widow way, carrying them with him in every choice, every step, and every challenge yet to come. The morning sun had barely risen over the desert when Caleb McAllister awoke with a sense of tension he could not shake. The previous encounter with the outlaws had left the town shaken, and though no sign of immediate danger remained, Caleb knew better than to trust the calm. The desert had a way of lulling people into false security, and he had learned from Nayeli that danger often came quietly, carried on the wind, and revealed itself only to those who paid attention. He dressed quickly and mounted his horse, moving toward the ridge where he and Nayeli had often observed the surrounding land. The desert stretched endlessly, golden under the rising sun. Yet Caleb's eyes were sharp, scanning every shadow, every movement. As he approached the ridge, he saw Nayeli already there, kneeling on a flat rock, her hands tracing patterns in the sand. Her expression was calm, yet her eyes reflected a deeper concern. "They are coming," she said without looking up. "I can feel it in the wind. The outlaws will return, and this time they will be prepared. They will not be careless." Caleb nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline. He had faced them before, but Nayeli's words reminded him that this encounter would be different. It would test not only his skills, but also his patience, his judgment, and his courage. He dismounted and joined her, careful to mirror her movements and to observe every detail she revealed about the land and the approaching threat. Nayeli led him through a series of natural formations, rocks, small ravines, and shadowed outcroppings that formed a hidden path overlooking the main trail the outlaws would use. "This is our advantage," she said. "The land will guide us, but we must act wisely. Haste is the enemy." Caleb followed her instructions closely. Every lesson he had learned in observation, patience, and awareness now became crucial. He noted the placement of rocks, the bends in the trail, and the subtle cues in the wind and sand. The outlaws were approaching faster than before, their horses kicking up dust and their voices loud with confidence. Yet Caleb felt no fear, only a focused determination. He trusted Nayeli, and he trusted the lessons she had taught him. As the outlaws drew near, Nayeli whispered, "Wait for the right moment. Do not act too soon." Caleb crouched beside her, heart steady, eyes fixed on the riders. He saw the youngest of the outlaws glance toward the ridge, unaware of the trap that had been set. Caleb recalled Nayeli's words. Strength alone was not enough. Wisdom and awareness were the real weapons. When the men reached the bend in the trail, Nayeli gave a subtle signal. Rocks were dislodged, startling the horses and forcing the outlaws to scatter in confusion. Caleb sprang into action, guiding the horses away from the townspeople and creating obstacles with fallen branches and sand-filled depressions. The plan worked with precision, a combination of strategy, skill, and the quiet power of observation. Once the outlaws were temporarily contained, Nayeli motioned for Caleb to follow her deeper into the canyon, away from the main trail. "There is more to this than they know," she said. "They think they are attacking a weak town, but they do not understand the strength here. And there is something you need to know about me." Caleb glanced at her, curiosity and concern mingling. Nayeli rarely spoke of her past, and when she did, it was in fragments, careful and measured. Now, however, her tone indicated that the time for hidden truths had come. They walked in silence, the canyon walls providing cover and the desert sun casting long shadows. When they reached a secluded spot near a small hidden spring, Nayeli stopped. "I was not always alone," she began, her voice quiet, almost reverent. "I had a family once, a husband and children. We lived peacefully near these lands, learning the ways of the desert together. Then came the raid." Her eyes darkened as she recalled the memory. "We were attacked by men who wanted to take what we had. My husband and children. They were taken from me. I survived by learning to rely on the land, to anticipate danger, and to endure grief without letting it consume me. That is why I warn you, Caleb. Do not look away from truth, from danger, or from life itself." Caleb felt a deep respect for her courage. He had faced danger before. But he could not imagine the loss she had endured and the strength required to continue living fully despite it. "I understand," he said softly, "and I will not look away. I want to learn everything you can teach me." Nayeli nodded. "Then you must trust yourself and the lessons you have learned. The outlaws are clever, but we can anticipate them. Their greed will be their weakness." Over the next few hours, Caleb and Nayeli prepared. They moved strategically, setting subtle obstacles and marking the best vantage points. Caleb realized how much he had changed since arriving in the desert. He no longer acted impulsively. He moved with caution, observing everything, and learning to anticipate outcomes. The Apache widow way had become a part of him. As the sun reached its peak, the outlaws returned, more cautious than before. They split into groups, attempting to search the town and surrounding areas, unaware of the hidden path Caleb and Nayeli had chosen. Caleb's heart pounded as he guided their movement, following Nayeli's lead, ensuring the safety of the townspeople and maintaining the advantage of surprise. The confrontation reached its peak when one of the outlaws discovered the hidden path. A tense standoff occurred, Caleb's hand hovering over his revolver, while Nayeli's eyes scanned for any opportunity to resolve the situation without unnecessary violence. Using clever distractions and knowledge of the terrain, they managed to separate the outlaws and guide them into a controlled area where the townspeople could remain safe. During the encounter, Caleb found himself recalling all the lessons Nayeli had taught him: patience, observation, courage, and understanding. Each decision he made was guided not by impulse, but by awareness. He felt a sense of clarity he had never experienced before. Strength alone would have failed. Wisdom and focus had prevailed. After the outlaws were finally forced to retreat, Caleb and Nayeli returned to the town. The people were relieved but awed by what had occurred. Caleb could see the gratitude in their eyes, but he knew the real victory was the knowledge and skills he had gained. Nayeli's teachings had not only helped them survive the threat, but had transformed him into someone capable of facing the unpredictable world with awareness and courage. That evening, as the town settled and the stars appeared over the desert, Nayeli and Caleb sat together near the spring. She spoke quietly of resilience, of facing the past, and of using knowledge to guide actions. Caleb listened intently, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him. "You have grown," Nayeli said softly. "You are learning to see without turning away. That is the greatest strength a person can have." Caleb smiled faintly, understanding that this journey was far from over. The desert had taught him lessons he could not have learned anywhere else, and Nayeli's guidance had opened his eyes to a way of life that required patience, courage, and wisdom. He realized that the challenges ahead would test him further, but he felt ready. He would face them with awareness, understanding, and the quiet strength of the Apache widow way. That night, under the endless canopy of stars, Caleb reflected on the day's events. The confrontation had revealed much about Nayeli's past and about his own growth. He understood now that life demanded more than survival. It demanded attention, understanding, and courage. And with Nayeli's guidance, he had learned to face both danger and truth without looking away. The desert, once a vast and intimidating expanse, now felt like a place of opportunity, learning, and strength. Caleb knew that the journey ahead would continue to challenge him, but he was no longer the impulsive cowboy who had wandered into this town weeks ago. He had become someone capable of observing, understanding, and acting with wisdom. And he would carry the lessons of the Apache widow way with him, forever changed by what he had learned. The desert morning was calm, the sun rising slowly over the mesas and painting the land in shades of gold and amber. Caleb McAllister stood on a ridge overlooking the settlement, his horse grazing nearby. The events of the past weeks, the lessons, the confrontations, the long hours of observation with Nayeli had changed him. He no longer saw the desert as just a place to survive or escape. He saw it as a teacher, offering truths to those patient enough to listen. And he knew that the lessons he had learned from Nayeli would guide him for the rest of his life. He turned as Nayeli approached, her steps quiet but deliberate. Her eyes reflected the strength and calm that had first struck him when they met. There was no need for words at the moment. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding. Caleb realized that their bond had grown deeper than companionship. It was rooted in mutual respect, shared experience, and the quiet wisdom of those who had endured much. "I see the difference in you," Nayeli said softly, breaking the silence. "You have learned not only to watch, but to understand. You have learned the way of endurance, the way of awareness. That is the Apache widow way." Caleb nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He thought of all that had happened. The hours spent observing the land, the careful tracking of animals, the moments of stillness, and the confrontations with danger. Each experience had been a lesson, shaping him, guiding him, teaching him that strength alone was not enough. True power came from knowledge, patience, and the courage to face life without looking away. Over the following days, Caleb continued to integrate what he had learned into his daily life. He helped the townspeople in ways he had never imagined possible, not with force or intimidation, but through guidance, teaching them to observe, anticipate, and act wisely. He showed them how to read the signs of the land, how to find water in hidden places, and how to move quietly and strategically when danger approached. The town began to thrive, not because threats had disappeared, but because its people had learned to face challenges with awareness and confidence. Nayeli watched silently as Caleb applied his lessons. She noticed the patience in his movements, the calm in his voice, and the clarity in his decisions. He had grown into a man capable of understanding not just the land, but the people around him, and he carried the Apache widow way within him. It was more than skill. It was a philosophy, a way of living fully with courage and respect. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the desert air cooled, Caleb and Nayeli rode together across the plains. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth, and the land stretched endlessly before them, quiet and beautiful. Caleb felt a sense of peace he had never known. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, felt distant now. He had faced danger, learned from it, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware. "You have changed," Nayeli said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not just in skill, but in spirit. You have learned to see what others ignore. You have learned to endure and to act with wisdom. That is the strength that comes from truly not looking away." Caleb smiled, feeling gratitude and respect for her guidance. "I could not have done it without you," he said. "You taught me more than survival. You taught me life." Nayeli's eyes softened. "You were willing to learn. That is why you succeeded. The world tests everyone, Caleb, but those who face it fully, without fear, without turning away, find the strength to endure. And you have done that." As the days passed, Caleb took on responsibilities in the town, helping to guide and protect the community. He was no longer a lone cowboy wandering from place to place. He had found purpose, belonging, and a way to live that honored both his own past and the lessons Nayeli had imparted. He understood that life would continue to present challenges, but he now had the tools to face them with courage, patience, and awareness. One evening, as the sky filled with stars and the desert cooled under the night, Caleb and Nayeli sat together near the spring. The town was quiet, the threat of the outlaws gone, at least for now. Caleb reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from a restless, impulsive cowboy to someone capable of understanding, observation, and endurance. He realized that the transformation had been as much about his inner self as about his outward skills. "You have embraced the widow way," Nayeli said, her voice gentle. "But remember, it is not a path with an end. It is a way of living, a commitment to see life fully, to act with awareness, and to face hardship without turning away. Carry it with you always." Caleb nodded, feeling the weight and importance of her words. He had come to the desert seeking work and refuge, but he had found something far greater, a new way of living, a philosophy that would guide him for the rest of his days. He thought of his past mistakes, his losses, and the moments when he had run from fear. Now, with the widow way in his heart, he felt prepared to face whatever the future held. As night deepened and the stars shimmered above, Caleb spoke softly. "Thank you, Nayeli, not just for teaching me, but for showing me how to live fully, how to endure, and how to face the world without looking away." Nayeli's eyes held a quiet pride. "You were ready to learn. That is why the lessons found you. Remember, strength comes from knowledge, patience, and courage, and the desert will always be here to guide those who listen." Caleb felt a deep connection to the land, to Nayeli, and to the lessons he had learned. The vast desert, once intimidating and unforgiving, now felt alive with possibility, guidance, and wisdom. He understood that the frontier was more than a place of survival. It was a teacher, revealing truths to those who observed carefully, acted wisely, and faced life without fear. The next morning, Caleb rode through the town, helping a group of children learn to track small animals and observe the land. He watched them carefully, realizing that teaching others was part of the widow way, passing knowledge, guiding with patience, and preparing others for the challenges they might face. Nayeli followed at a distance, her presence a quiet reminder of all he had learned. By midday, Caleb returned to the ridge overlooking the settlement. He dismounted, feeling a sense of calm and completeness. The town thrived. The desert was alive with signs and rhythms he understood, and his own spirit felt steady and clear. He realized that the journey was not about escaping the past or avoiding danger. It was about facing life fully, understanding it, and acting with courage and wisdom. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Caleb sat on a rock beside Nayeli. The desert stretched endlessly before them, quiet and beautiful, a reminder of the lessons, challenges, and growth they had shared. Caleb felt gratitude, respect, and a quiet sense of purpose. He was no longer a cowboy running from his past. He was a man transformed, carrying the Apache widow way in his heart. "You have learned well," Nayeli said softly, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Now live with it. Let it guide you, teach others, and shape every choice you make." That is the true path of strength. Caleb looked out over the plains, the wind stirring the sagebrush and carrying the faint scent of earth and life. "I will," he said quietly. "I will not look away." As darkness fell and the stars filled the sky, Caleb felt a sense of peace he had never known. The desert, Nayeli, and the lessons he had learned had transformed him. He understood that life would continue to bring challenges, dangers, and moments of hardship, but he was ready. He would face each one with patience, observation, and courage, honoring the wisdom of the Apache widow way in every step he took. And in that quiet, endless desert, under the vast sky, Caleb McAllister finally understood the meaning of resilience, endurance, and true strength. He had learned not just to survive, but to live fully, to see without fear, and to embrace the world without ever looking away.